All right, good evening. Welcome to part 2 of a 5-part series on women's issues. Tonight's topic is women in Kaddish. And this, of course, is an issue that is one of those areas where there's different opinions as far as what the correct attitude for a woman who has experienced a loss and would like to say Kaddish. This is especially pertinent when a woman loses a parent and would like to be able to say the memorial prayer for her parents in the form of saying Kaddish. Kaddish is a prayer that dates back to the times of the Talmud of the Gemara. It's written in Aramaic to reflect the fact that it was composed originally for children to recite in memory of their parents. It is also a prayer that was designed to be recited by the Shliach Tzibor, by the leader of the congregation, in order to lead his congregation in an affirmation of faith, a public affirmation of faith. And that is why Kaddish takes on two forms in our regular daily prayers. It is a leadership prayer that is led by the Shliach Tzibor, by the person who's leading the services, and that he says the Kaddish at various junctures in the davening. And it is also designed for the mourners that are present to recite mourners' Kaddish. The origin of Kaddish being the mourner's prayer is a very nebulous origin. Where the Gemara talks about Kaddish, it does not associate it with being a recitation that a mourner would say to memorialize a loved one. There's a very, very scant reference to it in rabbinic literature, and there's a very obscure medrash that tells us how Kaddish is associated with someone who wants to say a memorial prayer for their loved one. I'm not going to read the entire story tonight. It's a lengthy story. It is quoted in a number of sources in rabbinic literature. One of those sources is a very, very early commentary to the Siddur known as Machzor Vitri, from a medieval commentary to the Siddur, which tells us the proper protocol of the various prayers that a Jew is supposed to recite. I will tell you the story outside, and we're just going to read one line of the story inside, that underlined line in source number 1. The story begins to tell us, and the context of where you can find this story in Machzor Vitri is in the laws of prayers of Motzei Shabbat, of when Shabbos is over. And there's a custom that is brought down by Machzor Vitri that a person who has lost a parent has first rights of leading the service of Ma'ariv on Motzei Shabbos. And Machzor Vitri then brings this story. Rabbi Akiva was once walking on a path through a cemetery, and he encounters a man who is hunched over, whose skin is as black as a coal miner's from soot, and is schlepping on his back an inordinately large stack of thorns, thistles, and wood. It is such a large burden that it seems to be inhumane for any human being to be ordered to carry such a back-breaking load. He goes over to the person and he says to him, "If you're a slave, I'll arrange for your freedom. If you're a poor man, I'll arrange to have your debts paid off. Just tell me, how can I help you?" And the man turns to him and says, "I can't talk to you. They're going to punish me." And Rabbi Akiva says, "What do you mean?" And he says, "I am not of this world. I am a dead man. And I died with my sins. And my punishment that has been assigned to me from heaven is that I have to walk this earth and carry this huge burden on my back for who knows how long." And Rabbi Akiva is very distraught, and he says to him, "What can I do to lighten your load. That's what a tzaddik does. He sees a person, even a dead man, in distress. And he says, is there anything that they told you in heaven that can lighten your load and alleviate your punishment? The man says, there is something, but I know that it can never be. He says, because they told me in heaven that if there is someone who I leave over of my descendants who will lead the prayers and say Baruch Hu in front of the congregation, and will lead the congregation in saying Yehei Shemei Rabbi, then in that merit, my punishment will come to an end. He says, but my problem is that when I left this world, when I was taken by God, my wife was pregnant with our first child. And I do not know whether she even ever delivered, came to full term. And then the next part of the story, if you want to look at the underlined section, because this is how it's pertinent to our discussion tonight. V'hiniach et ishto me'uberet. He left his wife pregnant. Ve'eni yodea im yalda zachar. And I have no idea if she gave birth, and if she did, whether she had a male or a female. And it seems like from the story that if she had a female, this would not be possible. This tikkun. V'im yalda zachar mi melamdo Torah. And even if she had a little boy, who's going to teach that child Torah? Who's going to teach him how to read Hebrew? Who's going to teach him how to lead services? She'ein la'oto ha'ish ohev ma'olam, because when I left this world, everybody hated me. And why did everybody hate me? Because what was the sin that I committed when I was in this world, when I was alive? I was a tax collector, and I was a very corrupt tax collector. When it came time to collect taxes from my town, from my community, I let the rich people bribe me and line my pockets, and I oppressed the poor in my community to the point of causing many of their deaths. And therefore, there's no hope for me, Rabbi, leave me alone. And Rabbi Akiva says, I'm not going to rest until I track down your surviving child and find out what I can do for him or her. Tell me, what's your name? And the man says, my name is Akiva. Interesting coincidence, right? And he asks him his wife's name. Tells him his wife's name. What town are you from? I'm from the town of Ludkia. And Rabbi Akiva schleps all the way, takes him several days to get to the town of Ludkia. And he asks everyone in the town, did you know a fellow named Akiva who died recently? They said, may God grind his bones to dust. We want nothing to do with him. And they said, well, did he leave a widow? And they said, may she die quickly. Well, did she leave a son? They have a son, but he's not even circumcised. We won't even have anything to do with that family. So Rabbi Akiva asked them, point me in the direction of where they live. He finds the little boy, gives him a bris, and becomes his private tutor. And eventually, over the course of several weeks, months, years, we don't know how long it took, but finally that child started to become of age where he was able to recite the Kaddish in front of the community and the shul. And that night, when the child said his first Kaddish, this dead Akiva came to Rabbi Akiva in a dream and said, because of your efforts, I'm able to find my final resting place in heaven. That is this midrashic source. It's a very obscure midrash. It's not from one of the mainstream midrashim. It's from a very, very obscure midrashic source. And that is the source that we have, that Kaddish affects some kind of tikkun, some kind of rectification for a loved one. Now, that's the origins of mourner's Kaddish. The other four sections of our discussion tonight are, number one, the history, in Jewish history, that traditionally women were not permitted to recite the Kaddish. That's number one. The second part that I want to discuss with you, and that, by the way, there are exceptions historically to that as well. The second thing that I want to discuss with you after that is a responsum from Rav Eliyahu Henkin, who was a great leading posek. Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin was a leading posek during the 20th century, and he came up with a revolutionary approach to this idea. Then I want to talk to you about the dilemma of the mechitza, which I'll explain. And then we'll finally, if we have time, we'll talk about Birkat HaGomel as a related issue of a woman reciting a prayer in the presence of a minyan. Okay, so let's continue our discussion. Historically, women reciting Kaddish was frowned upon. It was strongly discouraged, if not outright prohibited. And let's look at just two responsa that discuss this issue. And I want us to be able to have an open discussion about this, to be able to, I'm not going to hide anything from you. I don't want you to hide anything from me. I'm going to put all my cards on the table. I'll share with you the halachic sources and the evolution of this halacha. And you come back with whatever you think you have. There are a number of sources who discuss the issue of a woman reciting Kaddish. And one of the very first sources from the late 17th century, Rabbi Yehuda Bacharach, called Chavot Yair. And we're not going to go through the entire responsum, but in source number 2 in your handout, you see the question as it is presented. She'ela. Davar ze na'aseh be'Amsterdam u'mefursam sham. The following thing has been done in Amsterdam, and people know about it there. She'echad nedar b'li ben v'tziva lifnei petirato she'yilmedu asara kol yom toch yud bet chodesh beveito bischara. There was a man who passed away, and he only had a daughter, he had no sons. And before he died, he gave charge in his will that there should be a minyan that gathers daily in his home to study Torah, and they would be compensated for that for the entire 12 months after his passing. What was the purpose? Ve'achar halimud tomar habat Kaddish. So that after they finished studying Torah, the daughter could say Kaddish after the Torah study. And we have such a practice, it's called Kaddish de Rabbanan. And that's a standard practice that after Torah study, one of the people who is studying Torah recites the Kaddish. We do that even today, even during Shacharis, where we recite a small Baraita, a small Mishnaic text, at the very beginning of services, and we have what's called the Kaddish de Rabbanan. If you're not familiar with that, it's the longer Kaddish. It's where there's a secondary paragraph, Al Yisrael, Ve'al Rabbanan, Ve'al Talmidei Hom, Ve'al Kol Talmidei Hom, Ve'al Kol Man De'askin Be'araita Di B'chol Atar Ve'atar. Familiar with that text, that longer Kaddish. Now, this was what this fellow gave charge to do. It's clearly indicated that he recognized that the synagogue would not permit his daughter to recite Kaddish. So he figured he has a good idea. Let me set it up in my house. I'll get my daughter to recite Kaddish at the end of 10 people's studies. V'lo biyada chachmei ha'kihila ve'haparnasim. The leaders of that community, the rabbis, the balabatim, did not protest. They said, okay, go ahead. Va'af ki ein raya listor hadavar, ki gam isha mitzuveit al kiddush Hashem, gam yesh minyan zecharim mikri b'nei Yisrael. He says, there is technically no reason to prohibit this. Because number one, what is Kaddish? Kaddish is sanctifying God's name in public. So anyone who recites Kaddish is sanctifying God's name. There's a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. A woman is equally commanded to sanctify God's name as a man is. So there's no reason technically why we should say that this applies more to a man than a woman. And there are 10 men who are present to act as the congregation. Va'af ki ma'isa de Rabbi Akiva shemimenu makor amirat yitomim Kaddish beven zachar haya. Maybe you'll challenge me from the story in the Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, where the story seems to imply that it was important for the leftover descendants to be a boy and not a girl. Mikol makom yesh svara degam bebat yesh toelet v'nachat ruach l'nefesh. But there's certainly a good argument to be said that even a daughter could provide the nachas ruach, the proper, how would you translate nachas ruach? The proper respite, the proper satisfaction to the soul of the deceased through her sanctification of God's name. Kizarohi, because after all, that's his descendant. And remember, what is the whole idea of Kaddish? Is that when I sanctify God's name, and I'm the remnant of that decedent, then God looks at that neshama that has passed away and says, wow, look at what you left in this world. Look at the great child that you left over in this world that creates some kind of elevation for the soul. Some kind of nachas ruach or korat ruach for the soul. Mikol makom, but then he says, yesh lachush, shal yedei kach, yechlishu koach haminhagim shel bnei Yisrael, shegam kein torehem. But my concern is this. After all has been said, that is not our minhag. We have to be concerned to preserve the protocols and traditions and minhagim that were passed down to us by our ancestors. And if to date there has been no such minhag, just because a person has created a patent, a great way of allowing Kaddish for his daughter to be said, just because technically it's permitted, doesn't automatically mean that we should be mandating it on a wholesale basis. V'yihye kol echad boneh bama le'atzmo al pi savarato u'mechazei mili derabanan kechucha ve'atlula v'yavo lizalzel bo. He says it'll turn out that every Jew who has a new idea, a new innovation that's technically within the confines of halacha, will be able to create a new practice. Like when I mentioned this to a group of men, I said, what if all of a sudden the BAYT decided we're going to do a new policy, that for Adon Olam, we're going to ask an honored member of the congregation to do an interpretive dance on the bima. And that will be how we celebrate the end of services. We'd like to call up Mr. Berkowitz, who will now do his interpretive dance of Adon Olam. Ladies and gentlemen, I present you with Mr. Berkowitz. And Mr. Berkowitz, or Mrs. Berkowitz, whatever the case may be, proceeds to launch into his or her interpretive dance. Is there any reason that we should say that this is a problem? None whatsoever. But from Rabbi Bachrach's point of view, this is an innovation. This is not something that is part of our traditional communal function, communal way that we do things within Klal Yisrael. And therefore he's uncomfortable with it. He doesn't feel that it's proper because it's going to cause ultimately a degradation in all other rabbinic practices, which are clearly mandated both in our halachic works and from a traditional standpoint. They've been being done for centuries. And that is his objection. Yes, would you like to ask a question?
My question is, Rashi had 3 daughters. Who said Kaddish for him when he passed away?
That's a good question. I don't know. You'll have to ask Rashi. Rashi had grandsons, though. Remember that. Now, we're jumping ahead of the game. I think you came in just a minute or two late, but I prefaced this by saying, I'm going to put all my cards on the table, and when I'm done, I want you to put your cards on the table as well. This is not to throw in your face, to put you down and say that this is what you cannot do. We're going to learn the sources, and you'll see where it's going to be an evolution of responsa that we're going to see tonight. And at the end of the presentation, we'll see where your mindset is at. So this is Rabbi Yehuda Bachrach, beginning of the 18th century, and this is the issue that he has. We go several decades later, Shuva Me'ahava, also from the 18th century, Rabbi Lazar Fleckelis, who also discusses this issue. Now remember, from the Chavos Yoyer's point of view, not even a consideration for a woman to say Kaddish in shul, but he's even uncomfortable for a woman saying Kaddish in a private home. Comes along Rav Fleckelis and says that even though I am aware of the Chavos Yoyer's tshuva, but he notes another precedent in another community. Rav Bachrach's precedent was from the town of Amsterdam. Now we go to Prague. And in source number 3, I apologize for the poor quality of the font, but it's from that time. He says, Aval ra'iti b'kila kadosha Prague minhag yafeh hakadmonim be'ezrat beit hakneset kloizen sham yashvu zekenim uzkenot ivrim upischim b'shacharit ad eight tza'arayim. He says, even though I've never seen any synagogue permitting a woman to say Kaddish, but here's what I have seen. I have noted that in the city of Prague, there's a very nice minhag that there's a cloister, like a side room in the synagogue structure, where after the morning prayers are finished, they allow all of the senior citizens who have no other place to go. There was no bingo back then. There was no art club or Zumba or yoga. If you were just a bored senior citizen, or if you didn't have a place to go for work, you came to the cloister, you came to the kloizen, and you sat there, and what did you do? You were a Tehillim Zugger. You recited the book of Tehillim for the entire morning from after Shacharis until the afternoon. V'omen b'chol yom kol sefer Tehillim. V'nohagim mishalo hiniach achar rabbanim ki im banos ketanos. Banot chamesh v'sheish shanim. Omrim sham HaKaddish. And the custom was that if a person died and did not leave over any sons, as long as he had a daughter who was under the age of bat mitzvah, such as 5 or 6 years old, remember he's very careful to point that out, 5 or 6 years old, we're not talking about an adult woman, then they would allow that young girl to recite Kaddish after the Sefer Tehillim was recited in that cloister. But aval b'beit hakneset hamiyuchad l'tfilah lo ra'iti kazeh me'olam. But, he says, to say that a woman would say Kaddish, or even a girl, a 5 or 6 year old would say Kaddish in the sanctuary of the synagogue, that we've never seen. Ve'eino nachon shetavo isha klal ketana o gedala lebeit tfilat ha'anashim. And furthermore, it is not appropriate for any female to enter into the sanctuary where men are praying. Asher ladat hazohar v'chachmei emet zal ha'isha bebeit Hashem keha'amadat pesel sham. He says, because allowing a woman to be inside the sanctuary where men are praying is like placing a statue of an idol inside the synagogue. Them's fighting words. Umali katan o gadol. And he says, and therefore, what difference would it make if it's a girl or an adult woman? V'lo ye'oten avdi otan ha'nashim ha'mevin b'noten ha'ktanot lebeit ha'kneset ya'an keshem shemitzvah lomar davar ha'nishma v'chulu. And furthermore, I will tell you, it is not appropriate that men bring their small daughters to shul. It's not right. I don't want to see girls running around in shul. But he says, I cannot elaborate on this point, because, as he says, just as that is a mitzvah to say that which will be heard, it is equally a mitzvah to stop saying that which will not be heard. And he says, I'm going to leave it at that. There you have it from the 18th century. Let us go on. Now, there are other, even more contemporary poskim who say that it's not appropriate for a woman to say Kaddish. Now, from this last response, and I want someone perceptive to point out something to me that should be somewhat bothersome. No woman should be coming into the men's sanctuary. What's the problem here? What's the problem here? What?
Isn't the sanctuary for everyone?
What about the women's section in the sanctuary? What about the Ezrat Nashim? Why wasn't that considered as a possibility for a woman to say Kaddish behind the mechitza? Okay? So I want to make sure that you understand that we need to temper this entire discussion with the understanding that the custom of saying Kaddish has changed over the centuries. Originally, the tradition of reciting Kaddish, whether you're a mourner or whether you're a shliach tzibur leading the services, is that only one person recites Kaddish at a time. As we're going to see from Rav Henkin, that it is only within the last century or two that this practice sprung up of allowing more than one person to say Kaddish at the same time. There are certain communities, such as the German prayer shuls, the Yekka shuls, where this practice is still intact, that they will only allow one person at a time to say Kaddish. So if you have 10 people in the minyan saying Kaddish, you may not get to say Kaddish that day, because they will have only, let's say, 5 Kaddishes that morning for Shacharis, and each person only gets to say Kaddish once. Okay? So please bear that in mind. The reason why it is such an abomination for Reflekelis, for a woman to say Kaddish, is because it was necessary for her to act as a Shliach Tzibor, to literally walk into the men's section, and to recite Kaddish as a singular person, to lead the entire congregation in the recitation of Kaddish, and she was the only voice. And that is the objection that he took. And this has very important ramifications when we study halachic responsa. We need to be aware of the circumstances behind the responsa, where sometimes just one small facet can change the entire halacha. Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin was a big posek. You know, you see that chart over there that says it's called the Ezra's Torah Luach? That is the Gabai's calendar that we get every single year, which tells us the protocol of every single day's prayers and Torah readings for the entire year. It is put out by an organization called Ezra's Torah, and the rabbinic leader, posek of the Ezra's Torah organization, and the Luach, and he was a Rosh Hashiva as well, was this Rav Henkin. He lived in America. He was a great halachic authority of great renown. And he came up with this idea about, where he talks about, can a woman, especially if she's the only surviving child of her parents, and she's the Kaddish shul, as they say, can she recite Kaddish? And his conclusion is, as you'll see in a moment, that she can, but with certain reservations. Now, he starts off, it's a much lengthier tshuva, but it's on source number 4. He wrote 2 tshuvas, he wrote 2 responsa on this subject. The first responsum that he wrote, the vast majority of the responsum was dedicated to an explanation of why people should say Kaddish in memory of a loved one. And this is a very important preface, which we're not going to see inside just because of space constraints and time constraints. But that's the majority of his responsum. And he points out there are 2 types of Kiddush Hashem. There are 2 types of ways of sanctifying God. One is where God sanctifies his name by bringing justice to the world, by bringing retribution to the wicked, by bringing reward to the righteous, and demonstrating to the world that there is a God. So for example, what's an example of a Kiddush Hashem of that nature? When Israel won the 6-day war, that was a Kiddush Hashem, but that was God doing the work. There's another type of Kiddush Hashem, which human beings can do, to demonstrate that they accept God's judgment upon themselves, despite the difficulty of that experience. But they know that this was God's decision, and they accept God's decision upon themselves nonetheless. That's also a Kiddush Hashem. He says that's what Kaddish is all about. Kaddish is a declaration of Yit Gadal, V'Yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah. May the great name of God be exalted and elevated, despite the fact that I am suffering. Despite the fact that I'm in pain and am suffering a loss, I hereby declare that I accept God's judgment upon myself. That's what the first line of Kaddish is all about. The rest of Kaddish talks about a time when we look forward to, that we won't have to bless God for the tragedies that happen in life, because there will be no tragedies that happen in life. Only things that are good will occur in the future. And therefore, may it happen very soon, that we see a resurrection, we see a redemption, and we see a time of pure goodness, where there will be no more death, where there will be no more suffering and tragedy. And everyone says Amen to that. So that is how the Kaddish sanctifies God. And why is Kaddish therapeutic for the decedent? It's therapeutic for the decedent because when a person dies and leaves over holy people who are prepared to sanctify God's name in the world, and God, as I mentioned, looks at that person and says, hey, you're a pretty good guy. Look what you left over in this world. Or you're a pretty good lady. But then Rav Henkin says something that's so important for us to hear. He says, if all you're prepared to do is sanctify God through a formulaic declaration, and it stops there, if you're not prepared to sanctify God's name through deed, through tshuva and ma'asim tovim, through doing mitzvot in the world, then that's a very shallow sanctification of God. And he takes it one step further. And he says, not only does the recitation need to be accompanied by deed, because deed is the main part of how you provide nachas to a decedent. By living your life in a moral, ethical, kind, compassionate, sensitive way, giving way, that's more powerful than any Kaddish. But then he also says that there are some people who are mistaken in their belief that Kaddish is like a magic formula. You know, he quotes a Zohar that says that whenever you say Kaddish, it alleviates an hour and a half of the decedent having to linger and languish in Gehenna. So he says some people look at that Zohar and they say, well, if every Kaddish shaves off another hour and a half, let me say as many Kaddishes as I can. And each Kaddish is another hour and a half of time removed. Time commuted. It's almost like when I think about this, I think about, if you've ever played Mario Brothers. Little Mario runs down the path, and he jumps up and he hits his head against that stone thing, and all of a sudden a coin pops up. So you say a Kaddish, ding, coin, right? You've alleviated you got one more coin. Run down the path, say another Kaddish, ding, you got another coin. He says, but that's not at all how it works. He says, if people say Kaddish without an understanding of that they mean to sanctify God's name in public, and it's just a formulaic recitation, that is really, really ineffectual. And he says, and that's why people mistakenly think that they need to say multiple Kaddishes a day. Kaddish was never designed originally the way that we do it today, where there are multiple Kaddishes. He says, you know why they made up a mourner's Kaddish at the very beginning of the service after Rabbi Yishmael? Because the mourners were coming late to services. Because the mourners realized that if the mourner's Kaddish is at the very end, what do I have to come at the beginning? So they instituted, just a few centuries ago, he says, they instituted a mourner's Kaddish at the beginning after Rabbi Yishmael so that you come on time. And originally, he says, like I said before, the minhag was only one mourner. But then mourners got upset. So they compromised and they added a few extra Kaddishes to allow for extra mourners. But the mourners still got upset. They got Beleidig and Broigus, and they got upset with the Gabbai and the Rabbi, and they said, I'm not contributing to the building fund anymore. And so finally, they didn't know what to do, so they said, okay, we'll allow multiple persons to say Kaddish at the same time. So that everybody can say Kaddish multiple times in the course of a service. And everybody's now happy. But it's not the optimal thing. He says, I want you to remember, for Chevra, he says, make sure you understand that the main thing about making a Kiddush Hashem that gives nachas to the decedent is the way you live your life, not the way you say Kaddish in shul. And it is based on that whole introduction that we come to the final paragraph where Rav Henkin says, now let me talk about a woman saying Kaddish. And that's the paragraph we're going to see now. So Rav Henkin says, V'navo li'inyan hatza'ah shel Kaddish lebat. So now let's get to our punchline, which is, should a daughter of a decedent recite Kaddish? Im habat tavo lihitpalel be'ezrat nashim. If a woman will come into the women's section of the shul, v'tachshir ma'aseha b'kedushat Shabbat, and she sanctifies her deeds through honoring the Shabbos, sanctifying the Shabbos properly. Kashrut, v'tahara, and she observes the laws of kashrus, and she observes the laws of family purity. Utzniut, and she dresses modestly. Shekol zehem ikarim, those are the main things. If she does all that, v'tachpotz lamar gam kaddish bifnei hanashim, and then in addition to all the things that she does, she also would like to say Kaddish in front of the women in the Ezrat Nashim. Bizman she'omrim Kaddish beBayt HaKnesset shel ha'anashim. While the men are saying Kaddish simultaneously in the men's section. Efshar she'en k'peda. Could be that we don't mind. Not, I encourage you. Not, I tell you, you must do this. Not that I tell you that this is something that was the only way that your parent's soul will get nachas. But could be it's okay. I'm just quoting for you very clearly exactly what he says. Aval im tavo leBayt HaKnesset. But if she's going to come to the synagogue, shel anashim, and she wants to go into the men's section to recite the Kaddish, afilu bilvushei tzniut, even if she's modestly clad. U'ma'kol shekain bilvushei America, shehem hefech hakedusha. And he says, and of course, this is not to say, I love this language. He says, I'm not talking about American clothing. American clothing, the way women dress in America today. I think he's writing this in the 30s or 40s. You got to think for yourself. The way women dress in America today is the opposite. She'ikara prisha meha arayot v'abizrayu shehem kol u'mareu pritzut ha'malbushim. He says, of course, we know that the source of all licentiousness and sinfulness in this area of life originates with a woman's voice, a woman's beautiful appearance, and her immodest clothing. Kol zehu hepech mikiddush Shem Sheman. That, of course, will result in the antithesis of a Kiddush Hashem. It will result in the opposite of a Kiddush Hashem. He says, U'mizeh yehi tsa'ar lahaniftarim v'lo korat ruach klal. That will only cause pain to the decedent and not satisfaction. Shekol zeh asur gam michutz leBayt HaKnesset. He says, because not dressing modestly is forbidden anywhere, even outside the synagogue. Aval Bayt HaKnesset hu ha'mivtzar ha'acharon sheshmirato notenet tikva likdusha bichlal. But he says the synagogue is the last fortress, is the last bastion of modesty. So if a woman comes in a tank top to the synagogue to say Kaddish, he says that's the ultimate breach of modesty protocol. Aval b'harisat ha'kedusha bo hakol avad chas v'shalom. He says when synagogue protocol has been violated, has been breached, then all is lost. May God help us all to sanctify and to be sanctified together with our fellow Jew. And that's the way how he concludes the tshuva. Later on, he has another tshuva. In Tafshin Zayin, which is how many years ago, Chevra? It's exactly 70 years ago. So 70 years ago, he writes a sequel to his original response, which we're now going to read, where it says number 2. He says, Ve'al derech HaKaddish. Let's talk about the Kaddish for a second. Im na'ara yechola lomar Kaddish beBayt HaKnesset. Can a young lady say Kaddish in shul? Hinei kvar dibru b'zeh ha'achronim. This has already been discussed by the later authorities. Uv'chol zeh zochreni shebiyalduti amra na'ara Kaddish lifnei ha'anashim b'kihila shel chasidim v'yireim. But I want to mention that I remember, in my youth, I remember a girl used to say Kaddish in front of the men in shul in a very God-fearing and pious congregation. He says, now listen, we know that the role of a person saying Kaddish is to be the shliach tzibur, is to be the leader of the services. And so therefore, let's say you have a man who was not worthy of leading services. His Kaddish is just as questionable as a woman saying Kaddish. Sharei kol ha'omer Kaddish b'tzibur hu me'ein shatz. V'shatz tzarich sheyeh hagun. He says because the shliach tzibur has to be an appropriate choice. to lead the congregation. So it's not just an issue of a woman saying Kaddish. Some men are not fit to lead the congregation. Uvekol zeh, but nevertheless, machazikim inyan hakadish ledavar hagun. And yet we still allow anyone who wants to say Kaddish to say Kaddish. Sheyadua, she'ilulei hakadish hayu nimnaim harbe milolamed et b'neihem tefillah. He says, because we know that if it weren't for the necessity of saying Kaddish, so many fathers wouldn't even bother teaching their children the prayers. He's my Kaddishal. I got to make sure he knows how to say Kaddish, so when I leave this world, I'll have someone to say Kaddish. So is that person who can barely recite Kaddish, is that the person that I want to lead the prayers? He doesn't even know how to read Hebrew. So there's so many times when the men who are saying Kaddish are just as not fit to lead the services as a woman. So therefore, it only strengthens the argument that there's not a problem for anyone to say Kaddish, male or female. But when you let people say Kaddish, this brings them closer to Judaism the rest of the year. And it's for that reason that we should not reject anyone who wants to come to synagogue, including women who want to say Kaddish, because through their coming to synagogue, that will bring them closer to Yiddishkeit invariably. Nevertheless, it is only appropriate that they stand on the other side of the mechitza and not come into the men's section. She should daven in the Ezras Nashim, and she should say Kaddish there. And I'll go even further, says Rav Henkin. Let's say a woman says, I don't want to stand behind the mechitza for Kaddish. If she pushes her way out into the men's section for the Kaddish, he says that's also going to be acceptable because since there are other men that are reciting Kaddish, no big deal. Even if she were to step outside of the mechitza and say Kaddish together with the men, not a big deal. Don't tell them I told you this. ובימי האחרונים שדיברו בזה היה מנהג שאחד היה אומר קדיש. ועל כן אין לה לנקבה לעמוד לפני התיבה לומר קדיש. He says, all those earlier responses that you know, that you are familiar with, which forbade a woman from saying Kaddish, he says it explicitly. Those were referring to a time when only one person was leading the Kaddish for the entire congregation. כי כך היה דרך הראשונים שאחד אומר קדיש היה אומר זה לפני התיבה. Where the person reciting the Kaddish, even a mourner, would have to come up to the stender, to the lectern, or to the amud, and that's where he would say the Kaddish. And that we're not prepared to permit. We would not permit a woman to come up to the stender of the Shliach Tzibur and to recite Kaddish from there, even if it's just for Kaddish. במקומו ורבים הם אומרים, אין להתחוזה בשתי ידיים, וכבר כתבתי שנכון שתעמוד אחרי המחיצה. He says, but nowadays, where everyone says Kaddish in their place, wherever they're normally seated in the shul, there's no reason for her not to say Kaddish, even if she goes outside the mechitza, but I've already said it's preferred if she stays on the other side of the mechitza. Ad kan Rav Henkin. Yes, Vivi.
It's not talking about the situation where there's no man saying mourner's Kaddish.
That he's not prepared to permit. You see, he's not prepared to permit that. He only permits if there are men saying Kaddish. And later poskim point out that in reality, when, let's say, a woman is the only person in the minyan saying Kaddish, you should have the Gabbai or the Shliach Tzibur recite Kaddish together with her. Yes. Okay. 2 generations after Rav Henkin, his grandson, also Rav Henkin, Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin, who's Shlita, who's still alive today. Unfortunately, you know him through a tragic event. His son was murdered together with his son's wife last Chol HaMoed Sukkos on the road to their home. But the senior Rav Henkin is still very much alive. His wife is Rabbanit Henkin, that many of you know. She spoke in our shul. And he is a huge, huge Talmid Chacham. And one of the roles that he plays is to clarify and elaborate upon his grandfather's responsa. And in one of his paragraphs, he points out that from my grandfather's responsum, you see very clearly that there is no issue of a woman allowing her voice to be heard in the public sphere. He says, because that was never part of my grandfather's objection. He never objected to a woman reciting Kaddish publicly. His only concern was that it be done in a modest fashion. But that a woman should be allowed to say Kaddish in a public setting is never a problem. And there are certain rabbis, he said, who suggest that it's forbidden for a woman to say Kaddish in a public setting lest she elaborates on the cantorial aspects of the Kaddish and she sing the Kaddish in some way, and this results in Kol Isha. He says, but that's clearly not a concern. He says, and I'll prove it to you. Because the Gemara says that technically, were it not for synagogue protocol, a woman would be allowed to be called up to the Torah to get an aliyah. We're not going to get into that tonight. But the Gemara itself says technically that would be permitted were it not for other considerations of synagogue protocol. Kavod HaTzibor is what the Gemara says. And Rav Henkin, the grandson, says, how could that ever possibly be if there's a concern about a woman singing the blessings and violating the rules of Kol Isha? So clearly that's not a concern. When a person recites a bracha, they're not singing a song. They're praying, and that's not a problem, therefore, of Kol Isha. Okay. Now, it may surprise you that not everyone accepted Rav Henkin's psak, not even in the 20th century. There were many Rabbanim, many poskim, who felt that Rav Henkin was not correct in his conclusion to permit a woman to say Kaddish even on the other side of the Mechitza. And to this day, there are many congregations which discourage women from saying Kaddish in their synagogues. We are not one of those congregations. We present a woman who would like to say Kaddish every option to do whatever she feels will bring the greatest honor to her parents. And we welcome women to say Kaddish here, based on this tshuva from Rav Henkin. It may surprise you that a former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, who was also a great speaker at our synagogue, opposed Rav Henkin many years ago in his responsa called Yachel Yisrael, which is you have in source number 6. He says, Ula halacha nir'eh she'ein lismoch al hetero shel hagri Henkin. It would seem to me that one should not rely on the heter of Rav Henkin. Uv'miyuchad b'yameinu yesh lachshosh lisvarat hachavot ya'ir v'hamishnat binyamin she'alulim lavo mitakenim leminehem v'yilmedu mikan lahatir lenashim lavor lifnei hateva. Especially nowadays with women's liberation, there's especially a concern that once you give them a finger, they'll take the whole hand. This is essentially what he's saying. Once we let women say Kaddish, they're going to want to become the chazanit, they're going to want to lead the services, and this is going to create a whole new revolution, and we should not permit it. And then eventually the whole system will get corrupted, and therefore we should not permit a woman to say Kaddish in our synagogues. As I mentioned, that's not our practice. We do permit women to say Kaddish. I will tell you quite openly that there have been situations where I know that a woman is the only survivor of her parents. She's the only surviving child. And I know, based on her emotional state, her spiritual state, that she would benefit from saying Kaddish, and I've encouraged certain women to say Kaddish. I will not tell you that this is something that I tell all women, but it's something that, based on the situation, sometimes I tell her she is permitted to say Kaddish if she would like. Sometimes I tell her she's encouraged to say Kaddish, depending upon her circumstance. The last few minutes I'm going to leave for questions, but I just want to mention 2 more points, and then I'll open up the field. Point number 1 is the dilemma of the mechitza. What do I mean by the dilemma of the mechitza? This is Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin raises the point that a number of poskim raise, which is how can a woman say Kaddish on the other side of the mechitza? The other side of the mechitza looks like it's a totally self-contained room. It's got mechitzot, it's got walls all around it. And the law is that you cannot recite Kaddish in the absence of a minyan. So if she's standing in the Ezras Nashim with, let's say, 2 or 3 other ladies, there's no minyan there. You need a minyan of men. How can she say Kaddish in the absence of a minyan? Rav Henkin has 3 different possible answers to this question, but for our purposes, it's quite clear that in most synagogues, at least the synagogues in North America that Rav Henkin was addressing, the mechitzot do not go up to the ceiling, as you can clearly see in the mechitza right over here. And therefore, even if it's completely surrounded, it does not count as a separate room. And for the purposes of saying Kaddish, she is considered to be standing amidst the minyan of men, even when she's behind the mechitza. So I want you to keep that in mind, that that is a concern raised by the poskim, and the grandson of Henkin addresses that. One final thing that I wanted to mention, and that is Birkat HaGomel, because that's the other time when a woman has both the opportunity and sometimes the obligation to recite a prayer in the presence of a minyan. Birkat HaGomel is also discussed by the poskim, and it's noted sometime in the late 19th, early 20th century, how did this minute get started that women don't bench goyim? If a woman has gone through a life-threatening experience where she narrowly escaped injury, she was in a car accident and something, God forbid, happened, and thank God she's still alive. If that would have happened to a man, he would bench goyim. Thank you, God, for saving me. Thank you, God, for providing me with something that I don't even deserve, and you saved my life. How come women don't bench goyim? And the conclusion of one of the poskim, the Knesset Yecheskel, which is quoted by other later poskim, is that a woman should bench goyim. And there's a common misconception that a husband can bench goyim for his wife. Not true. A husband cannot bench goyim for his wife. If you experienced a life-saving event, you can't have someone be your surrogate to express your thanks to God. You're the one that has to bring the sacrifice to Hashem and say, thank you, Hashem. You can't send your husband to do it. You can't send another shaliach to do that. That would be like sending someone to put on tefillin for you, to put on tzitzis for you. Or to pray for you. You've got to do it yourself. And so this is one of those instances where there are some kihilot, and it's brought down in the poskim, that at some point in the davening, or maybe at the end of davening, a woman would stand in the Ezras Nashim and say Birkat HaGomel, and the minyan outside would respond. They would answer Amen, and they would respond, because the law of Birkat HaGomel is that at least lechatchila, at least in an optimal situation, it needs to be said in front of a minyan. And this is one of those other situations. And here, too, we would apply that principle that it's permitted for her to say it on the other side of the mechitza because it's considered to be one room. Now, just as a matter of practice, and because a lot of people are not aware of this, I provide this to you as a public service. I get this question quite often. Rabbi, I think I need to bench goyim. What do you think? I say, yeah, I think, you landed on your head, and thank God you're still talking. I think you should say bench goyim. So what should I do? How do I do it? So I tell her that the next time you come to shul, ask your husband to gather together 9 other fellows, including himself. Go over to a corner in the Kaddish or in the lobby, and bench goyim. And there you have it. And there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing immodest about it. That's the way it's supposed to be done. Are there poskim who might take issue with it? Yes. But is this the way that I believe is the proper protocol, and that's what I do as a matter of course? Yes. Okay, let's open up the floor. Anyone with questions, comments, challenges? Yes, please.
So the same way that we can recite can have why can't you say from Kaddish? I mean, because the couple has daughters, and we have someone, wouldn't it be more meaningful for the daughter to say Kaddish than straight?
So the question is, would it not be more meaningful to the parents for their daughter to say Kaddish in a stranger? Quite possibly so. After looking at the review of all of the various rabbinic authorities who voiced their opinion on this matter, you have Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, who says that as long as she recognizes the role that Kaddish plays in the life of a Jewish woman and prioritizes it appropriately in line with all of the other things that she's doing with her life, then it is appropriate for her to say Kaddish. Absolutely. Well, Kaddish can only be recited in a minyan. It cannot be recited in the absence of a minyan. So yes, the answer is yes, it is quite often appropriate. Yes?
And it wouldn't be necessary for a man to be saying it as well?
Yes, well that's...
She wouldn't have to pay...
Technically, she would even be allowed to say it by herself, but as a matter of course, we require another man to say Kaddish together with her in order to be able to cover all of those other poskim who are not happy about it. Rav Henkin only dispensed his enter with the assumption that men are saying Kaddish at the same time. Yes?
So if a woman takes it on herself, would that mean Shabbos Mincha?
Okay, so this is a very good question. This is a very good question. The question is, once a woman accepts to say Kaddish for a parent, does she have to say it Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv? It would seem to me that if she's going to do it and going to accept it upon herself, she should take it as seriously as her male counterpart. There is a very rich history of women who used to be the first person in the shul in the morning, and used to be the last person in the shul in the evening. We don't find that so much anymore, but we find in the old Sfarim from earlier centuries that righteous women of every generation used to make it a priority to be in shul as often as they possibly could be. For some reason, that practice has fallen out of popularity. I say that only as an aside because I know that for many women, there's something uncomfortable, perhaps, or standoffish, put-offish about coming to shul during the week to daven, even when you need to say Kaddish. Part of it is our fault. When I say our, I mean it's us guys' fault. Part of it is our fault in that we have not really paid attention to the needs, perhaps logistically, of the women to have a comfortable space to say Kaddish. And we are always open to suggestions and to constructive criticisms. And if you have any, I'd love to hear them because we are always looking for ways to make prayer during the week, not just on Shabbos when you're wearing your beautiful clothes and your hat and everything, but during the week when you're on your way to work or on your way to do carpool or whatever it is, that you should feel comfortable coming to shul to daven or to say Kaddish. A lot of it has to do with the attitudes of men that are not in a leadership position in the shul, who take it upon themselves to be somewhat sexist. And they stand in front of the section where the women want to daven. And they just make it in general an uncomfortable experience of having to maneuver when you come in through the door to get into the Ezras Nash. So we try to put up signs from time to time, and we try to address the issue. But perhaps we don't do enough, and that too we would like to hear from you. Yes?
I said Kaddish for both my parents for the entire year. And I had several rabbis who approved of it. And several men approached me and said, don't you have brothers? I said, no, I don't, but that has no bearing. I always knew that when that day comes, God forbid I do it, I would everyone say it. Because I felt that I owed my parents that. And some people were not receptive to it. And I used to come behind that mechitza. And sometimes there were men down in there, and I would go. And they'd look at me and look away, and I said, well, I'm fine if you stay here, but I don't think you want me to. I mean, you should leave. And then they reluctantly leave. Finally, they got the
Who meant
message.
you that? They got the women out of the room.
Well, I wasn't going to remove them, some of them. Rabbi told once I would chase one into a parking lot because he said something inappropriate to me that I shouldn't be there at all. Oh, yeah. And I marched across all the men to Rabbi Todd, you don't know me. And I said, there's somebody there who's making me my life a misery. And he said, where is he? And it was between Mincha and Ma'ariv.
Well, kol hakavod to Rabbi Todd.
He chased him into the parking lot, but somehow he took a quick getaway. He said, you go back in there and
so I can only echo that. I would do the same for you. I take a stick with me. Yes.
So what's the idea of hiring somebody to say Kaddish? Can you
The
explain
reason
where
to
that-
hire someone to say Kaddish, it applies equally to men and to women. The reason to hire someone to say Kaddish is if you're not able to get to minyan regularly, because you have other responsibilities, you don't have perhaps the desire to be at shul every day. Plenty of people do this for various different reasons. There are also many women who perhaps would like to, let's say, feel a sense of fealty to their bubby or to their mother. And let's say my mother was a kind of person who would say, you are going to say Kaddish for me? Fat. Right? And if that was her attitude because she came from the old country, and I know my mother wouldn't want me to say Kaddish for her if I'm a woman, so then maybe it does make more sense. Again, it's a very personal issue. And you have to be able to think it through and to talk it through with people and to come to your own conclusion. But having someone say Kaddish for you is really, really not as great as the child themselves saying Kaddish. Yes?
If there are no sons and a daughter does say Kaddish for her parent, is it still advisable to have a man or a grandson say Kaddish also for her or him?
The question is to have a grandson.
If the
Let's say a
daughter-
daughter is saying Kaddish for a parent,
But is it also
but she would also like someone else in the family, like a grandson, to say Kaddish as well. That's her prerogative. And there could be arguments to be made why maybe that's preferred, because maybe the grandson will lead services occasionally, which is not something that mom can do. Or maybe because she has a preference for him to do it because he'll be more regular at the synagogue than her. There might be any number of reasons why she might prefer for a male to do it instead of her. Yes.
But if the grandson has both his parents, he shouldn't be allowed to say it.
Well, that's a very good question. Is a grandson allowed to say Kaddish for a grandparent if both of his parents are alive? That's also a misconception. The halacha states that a child should not say Kaddish if both of his parents are still alive, with the following exception. If the parents say, please say Kaddish for my parent, then that's an express, a desire expressed by, because the whole reason you shouldn't say Kaddish when your parents are alive is because it causes pain to your parents. What are you saying Kaddish? I'm not dead yet, right? But if the parent says, please say Kaddish, because it'll be meaningful for me, so that you should be the Kaddishal for my beloved mother or father, so that's a whole different story. Yes.
Is that the same thing as Yosef candles?
Is it the same as yahrzeit candle as far as what? As far as women lighting a yahrzeit candle versus men?
My father asks me to light a Yahrzeit candle for his parents.
Absolutely.
Because where he lives, he can't.
Uh-huh.
But I have both my parents alive.
Right. There's no reason not to light a yahrzeit candle if one's parents are alive. That would be permitted even if your parents are still alive and they didn't ask you to light a yahrzeit candle.
I thought it was
Yeah.
that I was told that I shouldn't.
No, it's perfectly fine. Yeah. There are many people who have the custom of lighting a yahrzeit candle, let's say every Yom Kippur. Most homes light a yahrzeit candle, even when they still have all their parents. Because there's nothing wrong with it. Yahrzeit candle is just a minhag, so there's nothing wrong with it. Yeah. Yes?
It seems to me that all the circumstances you described are when a woman loses a parent, but what about spouse, child, sibling?
The same would apply. The reason for saying Kaddish still applies over there. In those other cases that you described, Kaddish would only be said for 30 days instead of the full year. Yes, yes.
If you have undertaken to say Kaddish and for some reason you can't go to shul on a particular day, I was told that you could study something that day and that would sort of take its place.
Well, as we mentioned before from Rav Henkin, Kaddish is really the secondary way of creating nachas for the soul of the departed. So really, anything that you do of substance, an extra mitzvah, giving tzedakah, doing something kind for others, as long as you do it with your deceased's memory in mind, that certainly can take the place of Kaddish. There is a custom that people have that when they can't say Kaddish for that particular day, they ask someone who they know is going to shul to say it on their behalf. And that's also acceptable. I think we're going to hold it here. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Next week is a review of the laws of the Shabbos kitchen.